The smoke found her before the flames did. Mira pressed herself flat against the side of the granary, splinters biting into her palms, and counted heartbeats the way her mother had taught her. 3 slow ones when the world came apart. 3 slow ones to find the thread back to sense. 1. The screaming was real. 2. The orange light blooming over the mill roof was real. 3. The horses, 3 dozen of them at least, iron-shod and thundering down the road that split the village of Ashfin in 2, were absolutely, terribly real. She did not wait for a 4th breath. She ran. The raid had come from the North Road, which meant the South Bridge was already lost. She'd heard it in the pitch of the shouting, in the crack of wood that wasn't fire. That left the miller's alley, the tannery lot, and one narrow gap between the cooper's yard and the low stone wall, where the merchant caravans always staged before dawn. She had lived in Ashfin for 22 years. She knew every gap, every loose stone, every dog that would bark and everyone that wouldn't. She also knew, in the way her body knew things before her mind caught up, that the smell on the air was not just smoke, pine resin, leather, cold iron, guard soldiers, pack soldiers, someone's war come to their doorstep. Mira turned the corner into the cooper's lot at full sprint and nearly ran face first into a carriage. It was enormous. That was her first thought. Absurd and completely useless. The thought of a woman on the edge of panic, because she had seen merchant carriages, courier carriages, even the Lord Warden's gilded thing that rolled through twice a year collecting tithes, and none of them had looked like this. This one was black. Not painted black, not lacquered. Black the way a night sky is black, deep and lightless and absolute. The wood so dark it seemed to pull light toward it rather than reflect any back. The wheels were iron-rimmed. The horses, 4 of them, massive and still as statues, were the color of old charcoal, and the crest pressed into the door was a wolf mid-leap, silver, the size of a man's fist. She did not recognize the crest. She opened the door and climbed inside. The smell hit her the instant the latch clicked shut behind her. She nearly choked on it, nearly backed right out again because it was not the smell of an empty carriage. Pine and iron, yes, but beneath that, something warmer, something animal. Old power and dark earth and the particular cold clean scent of a man who does not need to prove himself because the world has already arranged itself around him. Someone was in this carriage with her. She spun toward the far bench, her heart slamming, and found him watching her. He was sitting in the corner the way a man sits when he has been sitting for a long time and has no intention of stopping, one arm resting along the window ledge, one boot crossed over the other knee, entirely still. He wore no armor, just a dark traveling coat, the collar turned up, and riding gloves that had been folded and set on the seat beside him with the kind of precision that suggested habit. His hair was black and slightly too long, touching the collar. His eyes, even in the dark, caught what little firelight pressed through the carriage curtains and threw it back silver. He looked at her the way mountains look at weather, patient, absolute, waiting to see which way she would break. Mira's mouth opened. She closed it. Outside, the horses screamed and something, a beam, a door, hit the cobblestones with a sound like a god setting down a piece of furniture. "Sit down," he said. 2 words, low, unhurried, with the particular resonance of a voice that gave orders so seldom it had never needed to practice, the kind of voice that did not ask twice. She sat. He reached past her. She flinched, and his gaze moved briefly to her face at that, cataloging something, and drew the curtain fully closed. The orange glow from outside went dark. The carriage filled with shadow and the sounds of burning and his scent, which was somehow both grounding and the most alarming thing Mira had ever encountered, because her wolf blood was reading it the way it read everything. Fear response down, threat response up. The old territorial instinct in her hindbrain pressing against her ribs and saying softly and insistently, "This one is above you. This one is high rank. This one is—" "Don't shift," he said, without looking at her now. He was watching the curtained window, perfectly calm. "Not in here. I wasn't going to." Your eyes changed. She pressed her nails into her palms. They hadn't been having a conversation. She had been having a panic response, and he had been annotating it like a man making notes in a margin. The carriage lurched. The driver, invisible behind the roof, had apparently decided the carriage should begin moving, and who could blame him? Because the sound of the raid was no longer distant. It was the next street over, close enough that Mira could smell singed grain and the copper-bright hot metal smell of torches. Close enough to hear voices shouting commands in a dialect she almost recognized. An eastern border dialect, pack dialect, and her stomach clenched around that knowledge like a fist. Pack soldiers. Not bandit raiders. Not mercenaries. Someone's pack soldiers had done this to Ashvin. The carriage moved south at a pace that suggested the driver was extremely motivated, and the man across from her settled further into his corner as though they were on a pleasant afternoon outing, and Mira watched the darkness shift outside the curtain and tried to think. Her name was Mira Valden. She was the daughter of a cooper who had died 11 years ago, and a mother who had died 3 years after that, which meant she had been managing Ashvin's accounts, because she was the only person in a village of 400 who had both the numeracy and the stubbornness to do it. For 8 years, entirely on the strength of being the person no one could easily say no to. She was not a warrior. She was not a pack-born noble with a wolf bond strong enough to shift cleanly in a crisis. She was a border village woman with an illegitimate thread of wolf blood, a head for numbers, and a deeply inconvenient habit of noticing things. She noticed, for instance, that the man across from her had not asked who she was. He also had not ordered her out. She noticed the way his stillness was not the stillness of a man at rest, but the stillness of a man actively choosing not to move, coiled, controlled. The stillness of an apex predator in the moment before it decides whether this particular situation requires its attention. And she noticed, because she was practical before she was anything else, that she had absolutely no idea whose carriage she was in. "Where are we going?" she asked. He didn't look at her. "South." "South where?" "South away." A pause, so brief she almost missed it. "That seemed to be your primary objective." It was not unkind. It was also not kind. It was simply accurate, delivered in a voice that had apparently been carved from the same material as the carriage itself. Dark, immovable, waiting. Mira pressed her back against the seat and folded her hands in her lap and decided that south away was, in fact, sufficient for the moment, and looked at the closed curtain and listened to the village burning behind them. She did not let herself cry. That was its own kind of information. She noted it the way she noted everything, filed it under. Things to examine when not sitting in a stranger's carriage while one's entire life smolders into cinders. The accounts she had kept for 8 years. The copper measuring weights that had been her father's. The letter from the territorial clerk in Dawnmere that she had never answered, because answering it would have meant leaving Ashvin and she had not been able to make herself do it. All of it smoke now. And here she sat, knees together, hands folded in a carriage that smelled like old power and dark pine, across from a man who moved like something that had never had to hurry in its life. She looked at him directly for the first time since sitting. He had a scar. It ran from the left corner of his jaw to just below his ear, thin and old and completely at odds with the rest of him. The coat, the gloves, the controlled stillness. It looked like something got close enough once to leave a mark before he ended it. The scar had its own texture, slightly raised, and she could see it clearly when the road shifted, and a gap in the curtain let through one thread of moonlight. His jaw was working, very slightly, the way a man's jaw works when he is grinding down something he hasn't decided to say yet. She looked away. The road ran smooth beneath them for a while. The sounds of Ashvin faded. Mira had a headache building behind her left eye, the kind that came from too much smoke and too much adrenaline and not enough water, and she breathed through it and thought about what she knew, which was pack soldiers, Eastern border dialect, a raid pattern she had seen once before, 9 years ago, in the village of Lirith, which was 20 miles north, which had been raided for tax arrears under the orders of Lord Aldrich Voss, who held the northern border territory, and who had the particular combination of ambition and grievance that made men do ugly things to small villages. Lord Voss. She knew that name. Everyone on the border knew that name the way they knew the name of a bad winter, by the damage it left behind. Her jaw tightened. The man across from her said nothing. The carriage rolled on. She must have slept, which was humiliating in retrospect, because she woke with her cheek against the padded wall, and her neck aching, and the light outside the curtain had changed entirely. Not the orange of fire, but the gray-blue of very early morning, the kind of light that looked like an apology for what the night before had done. Her whole body felt hollowed out, the particular emptiness that follows fear. She sat upright too quickly, which made the headache pulse, and she pressed 2 fingers against her left temple and breathed. He was still awake, or awake again. She could tell because the quality of the carriage's silence had changed. When she'd been asleep, or assumed he'd been asleep, it had been a thick silence, settled. Now it was the live kind, the kind with attention in it. "You should drink," he said. She looked up. He was holding out a silver flask. He hadn't moved from his corner. He had simply extended his arm, the flask balanced in his gloved fingers, with the air of a man who would not repeat the offer. She took it. Water, cold and faintly mineral, the kind that came from deep-dug wells in stone country, and she drank 3 mouthfuls before she could stop herself, which was 3 more than she'd intended to accept from a stranger. She capped it and held it out. He didn't take it back. He simply returned his arm to the windowsill. "Keep it," he said. Her pride made a small, protesting sound somewhere behind her sternum. She overruled it. The flask went into her coat pocket. "I'm Mira," she said. It came out less certain than she intended, which annoyed her. Something shifted in his expression. Not softened. Shifted, like a very large stone choosing a slightly different angle. "I know." She stared at him. "You can't possibly know that. Your face is well known in Ashvin. I arrived there 4 days ago." He paused. "You argued with a grain merchant on the main road about the legitimacy of his scales." She had. She remembered it exactly. Paul Denner, who had been shaving his weights for 2 seasons and thought no one had noticed, and she had stood in the road with her account ledger open and explained to him, in full public, precisely how much he owed the village common fund. She was not the least bit sorry about it, even in retrospect. "Most men won't argue with a woman holding a ledger," she said. He did. He lost. Something crossed his face so fast she almost missed it. A line that appeared at the corner of his mouth and disappeared before it became a smile. "He did," the man agreed. Mira's chest did something involuntary. She pressed her folded hands harder together and looked at the curtain. Outside, the road had changed. The rattle of cobblestones was replaced by the softer crush of packed earth, and she could smell grass and early morning cold, a country road rather than a village track. They were well away from Ashvin, too far to walk back before the day got dangerous. She thought about asking where they were going, more specifically this time, and then decided against it, because she wasn't certain she was ready for the answer. She was not, as a general rule, a woman who did things without being certain. She had built her entire life in Ashvin on the principle that certainty was a resource you created through preparation, and that most bad situations could be traced back to someone who had failed to think 3 steps ahead. Her blind spot. She knew this about herself, had known it for years, had simply found it impossible to correct, was that the preparation gave her a kind of rigidity. She planned, and when the plan held, everything was fine. And when the plan dissolved entirely, she was sometimes slower than she should have been to reach for a different one. She had not planned for any of this. Not the raid, not the carriage, not this man. She looked at him again. "You haven't told me your name." "No." A silence. "Are you going to?" His eyes moved from the curtain to her face, and the weight of that was different than it should have been. The way the first step off a cliff is different from the last. Silver gray eyes. Old amber lamplight in the carriage now, she could see the color clearly. The kind of eyes that had looked at a great many things and found most of them unimpressive. "When we stop," he said. Mira decided this was not a satisfying answer, and also that she was not in any position to demand a better one, and so she sat with the unhelpfulness of it, and watched the gray sky lighten through the curtain's edge and thought about what burned and what was left. The way station at Mere Hollow was built for exactly this kind of morning. It was a border way station, which meant it was low-roofed, stone-walled, staffed by a woman named Dara, who had iron-gray braids wound twice around her head, and who managed the station with the serene efficiency of someone who had seen every variety of travelers' distress and sorted them all into categories. Mira catalogued her the instant she stepped down from the carriage. The braids, the thick-soled boots, the way she looked at the black carriage and went very still before visibly deciding on a particular register of deference. Mira noticed the deference. She noticed it especially because Dara was not a deferential woman. She looked back at the carriage, where the man in the dark coat was descending the step with the fluid, unhurried economy of someone whose body was extremely good at its job, and she thought, high rank. She had thought that since the carriage, since his scent, but there was rank, and there was... The driver called down from his seat. "Way station secured, my..." and then stopped, catching himself, substituting the pause for a nothing. The man glanced up at the driver. The driver looked away. Mira's attention sharpened. Dara came down the station steps with her hands folded and her chin lowered at an angle that was almost, not quite, a bow. "Welcome to Mere Hollow Station, you're..." "Just travelers," the man said. Quiet. Final. Dara's mouth closed. Opened. "Of course." She looked at Mira with a question she was not going to ask, and Mira looked back with an answer she didn't have, and they understood each other perfectly. They were given the main room, a long table, a fire already built up against the morning cold, bread and hard cheese and a pot of tea that smelled of dried clover. The driver, she saw him up close now, a wiry man with an old burn scar that had taken most of his right ear, which was how she'd remember him after, took a plate and went outside. The guard, tall and silent, did the same. That left Mira and the man with no name sitting across a table the length of her outstretched arms, with tea between them and the smell of smoke still in her hair, and the weight of the morning pressing down. She poured 2 cups because her hands needed something to do. She pushed one across to him. He looked at the cup, then at her. Then he picked it up, and the quality of his attention shifted into something she didn't have a name for yet. "Your village burned last night," he said. Not a question. "My village burned last night. You have people there?" She thought of the accounts, the weights, the letter she hadn't answered. "No," she said. "Not for a few years now." He nodded, a single motion, as though she had confirmed something he'd already calculated. She watched his hands around the cup. Large hands, careful hands, the kind that knew what they could break. The gloves were off now, folded beside the bread plate, and she could see the scar on his jaw better in the firelight. Old, professional, left by something with an edge rather than blunt force. She said, "You're going to tell me your name now." "Yes." A pause. Calder Voss. The fire crackled. A log shifted and threw a spark. Mira watched it die on the hearthstone and thought, very clearly, in the sudden cold quiet of her own head, "Voss." She set down her cup. Slowly, because her hand wanted to shake and she would not allow it. "The Alpha King," she said. Flat, just the words. "Yes." "And Lord Aldrich Voss, my cousin, who burned Ashfin." "Yes." His voice had gone very quiet. She could not read it. "Under my name." She looked at him across the table in the fire and the length of the morning and thought, there it is. There is the thing the morning was building toward. He sat still, that familiar, terrible stillness, and watched her understand it, and did not try to soften any of it. And that, somehow, was the most infuriating thing he had done yet. She stood up. The bench scraped back. "You knew." "I knew Aldrich had border ambitions. I did not know he had executed a raid last night, or that Ashfin was his target. You were there. 4 days ago you were investigating." His voice was still low, still even, but she could hear now what she had been too frightened and then too tired to catch before. An edge underneath. Something hot and contained. The way a banked fire is still fire even when it doesn't show flame. "I came to the border because I had intelligence suggesting Aldrich was moving against the settlement villages. I was gathering evidence." "Gathering evidence," she said. "While he was planning." "While he was planning." "While Ashfin was 4 days behind you." His jaw worked. There was the scar. There was the grinding down quality of a man who was not going to say the thing she needed him to say because he had decided it would not be sufficient. He looked at the table. One breath. Then he looked at her. "I made a calculation," he said. "I was wrong." She pressed her fingers flat against the tabletop and breathed through the headache and the smoke smell and the very specific fury of a woman who has been wronged not by malice but by something worse. By a man who was competent and careful and still got it wrong when it counted, and who knew it and was sitting with that knowledge rather than running from it. "I need some air," she said. "The door is behind you." She walked out into the cold. The morning was young enough that the sky still held some of last night's character. Not dark, but not light either. A bruised violet gray above the tree line. And the road was empty in both directions, and the grass beside the way station wall was silver with frost that would be gone in an hour. Mira pressed her back against the stone wall and looked up. Her wolf blood was humming. It had been humming since the carriage, since she'd first caught that scent. And she had been suppressing it with the efficiency of long practice because she had grown up in a border village with an illegitimate wolf thread, and had learned early that the choices her wolf blood made were not always the choices Mira Valden could afford. Her blood wanted things she couldn't have. Her blood had been wanting them since she was 17, and had met a pack son passing through, a young man with easy confidence and old money manners, and had wanted him so much it had taken her 2 years to stop thinking about him. She had learned her lesson from that. She had apparently not learned it well enough. because her blood was not humming about danger. It was not sounding a threat alarm or a flee response. It was doing something else, something older and more specific, something she could not afford to name out loud even standing alone in a cold field, because naming it would make it real. And it was absolutely not real, because the man in there was the Alpha King of the Northern Packs, and she was the accountant of a village that no longer existed, and that was the entirety of all of it. The door opened. She did not turn around. She could tell by the sound of the step. He walked with his weight balanced differently than other men, quieter for his size, that it was him. He stood beside her against the wall, not close, a careful distance. She could still smell him anyway. "There's a warrant out for Aldrich," he said, after a moment. "Signed before we left the capital. What he did last night, the raid, the burning, he did it without my sanction, and the warrant exists, and he will answer for it." "That's—" She stopped, started again. "That doesn't rebuild what burned." "No." "It doesn't give back what people lost." "No." A pause. "But it is what the law has to offer, and I will make certain it is fully offered." She turned her head and looked at his profile. The scar, the jaw that was still working, still grinding down something unsayable. He was looking at the tree line as though it had done him a personal injury. "Why didn't you tell me in the carriage?" she asked. A long silence, long enough that the first bird started up somewhere in the trees, thin and bright in the cold. "Because you were frightened," he said, "and you'd already found your spine again, and I didn't want to." He stopped. The grinding quality came back. She waited. "I didn't want you to stop," he said, quiet, looking at me as though I might be, as though this was... He stopped again, and this time he didn't continue, and she understood from the way he went back to the tree line that he had said more than he'd intended, and had decided to stop before it became something he couldn't take back. Her chest did that thing again, larger this time. She looked back at the road, breathed. "There's a settlement fund," she heard herself say. "The Crown's Border Settlement Fund, for villages that suffer pack military action. Yes. Ashfin would qualify. Yes." A pause. "I'll see to it personally." She nodded, filed it, set it beside the anger and the loss and the exhaustion in the long mental ledger she was keeping, because that was what she did when she didn't know what else to do. She kept accounts. They stood there together in the violet-gray morning cold until the bird in the trees was joined by two others, and then the driver appeared in the way station doorway and waited, and the Alpha King straightened off the wall, and Mira Valden looked at her burned village behind her, and the dark carriage waiting in front of her, and made a choice. She got back in. The road south stretched through pine forest and river bottom country, and the sky went from violet to gold to the honest hard blue of a clear autumn day, and Mira sat across from Calder Voss and tried to remember what she knew about Alpha Kings. She knew the theory. Everyone in the packs knew the theory, the way everyone knew the shapes of the constellations even if they couldn't navigate by them. An Alpha King was not simply a high-rank alpha. He was the bond sovereign, the wolf whose pack bond extended over all the territories, who could feel the health of every pack in his domain the way a man could feel his own heartbeat. The bond was not metaphorical. It was physical. It ran through his blood, his wolf sense, the particular scent resonance he carried that distinguished him from every other man who had ever walked into a room. She had noticed the scent. She had been noticing it for hours. Her wolf blood read it and translated it into something that bypassed words entirely and spoke directly to the part of her that was old and animal. Sovereign. Packheart. Highest. She had been sitting in a carriage with the alpha king of the northern packs for 6 hours and had argued with him over accountability, and had drunk his water and pushed tea at him like he was a tradesman who'd had a hard morning. She pressed the bridge of her nose. "You're thinking very loudly," he said. "I'm not. You've made the same face 4 times. She put her hands in her lap. "I've been rethinking the last few hours." "Unfavorably?" She looked at him flatly. He looked back, and there was something in his expression that might, on a different man, have been the precursor to humor. On him it was just a slight decrease in severity, like a winter sky deciding to soften to overcast from full storm. "I pushed tea at the Alpha King," she said. "You did." And argued, comprehensively. She held the flat look. "And you didn't correct me." Something shifted in his face. Not the maybe humor this time, but something underneath it, something more careful. "No," he said. "Why?" He looked at the curtain. She watched his profile, the scar, the jaw, the particular way he had of holding himself still that she was starting to read not as coldness, but as care, the way a man who has broken things holds himself still. "It's been some time," he said, choosing each word, "since anyone argued with me about anything." The fire between her ribs got complicated. She looked down at her hands and thought about that, about what that meant, about being the most powerful wolf in 6 territories, and sitting alone in a dark carriage while a border village smoldered, and the people around you called you your, and stopped and looked away, because no one wanted to be the one to finish that sentence in a new way. She breathed. "You were in Ashford for 4 days," she said. "Yes." "And you watched me argue with Paul Denner. Among other things." She kept her voice careful. "What other things?" A pause. "You keep the market accounts. You audit the tithe records yourself, every quarter, instead of sending them to the Lord's clerk. You arbitrate disputes, and you do it badly, because you're too decisive, and you don't let people feel they've had their say before you rule." He paused. "And you have a habit of standing at the east end of the market square in the early evening and watching the road, and you do it the same way every time, left hand on the low wall, right hand in your coat pocket, as though you're waiting for something." She sat very still. "What am I waiting for?" she asked quietly. His eyes found hers across the carriage, silver gray in the autumn light, ancient and careful and something else, something she didn't have the vocabulary for yet, something her wolf blood was attempting to name in a language she hadn't spoken before. "I don't know," he said, "but I've wondered." The carriage hit a rut, and both of them shifted slightly, and the spell, such as it was, bent like a drawn bow and held. Mira looked at the curtain. She was in trouble. She understood that now with the same clear-eyed practicality she brought to all arithmetic. She had a wolf bond pulling toward this man like a compass needle toward north, and he was the Alpha King, and she was a border village accountant with no pack standing and no family name, and a head full of tithe tables, and whatever was happening in this carriage was not something that belonged in a world she understood how to navigate. She was also, she thought, in the specific and extremely inconvenient situation of having started to want it anyway. The town of Silver was 3 hours further south, and it was a real town, not a way station. Stone buildings 2 and 3 stories tall, a market square with 4 permanent stalls, an inn that could accommodate 12 horses, and the particular energy of a place that ran on trade and therefore had a relationship with politics that was both intimate and entirely mercenary. Mira had been here twice, years ago, with trade documents for the district clerk. She noticed, stepping down from the carriage, that the town seemed to know they were coming. That was not the right word. The town had not been informed. But the market square, which should have been mid-morning busy, was watchful. Subtly so, in the way that people in trade towns became watchful when something with weight moved through. Conversations that paused a half-second too long, hands that found other things to do, heads that didn't quite turn. The driver brought the carriage to the inside yard, and the tall guard materialized from wherever guards materialized from, and Calder Voss descended the step and stood in the morning light, and Mira watched the ripple move through the square. He hadn't announced himself at Mere Hollow. He'd suppressed the driver's near slip. But here, in the way he stood, the economy of it, the absolute certainty of a man who had never needed to take up more room than he occupied, the square read him anyway. Rank radiated. It came off him like heat off a forge, and every wolf blood in 100 meters felt it in their hindbrain, and responded. She felt it. She had been feeling it for hours. She also noticed, because she noticed everything, the woman who came out of the inn. Young, dark-haired, dressed well for a border town, with a traveling coat that had been made somewhere with better tailors, and a face that was strategically beautiful, Mira thought, the kind of beauty that had been arranged for effect. The woman saw Calder Voss, and her whole bearing changed, became warm and directed and specific, and she crossed the yard in a line that would intersect his. My Lord King. A low incline of her head, not quite a bow, precise enough to suggest court training. Lady Voss was hoping you'd come through Silvere. I'm sent ahead to tell you she's waiting at Greymere. Mira stayed where she was, 4 feet back, and watched his face. Nothing moved on it. Not his jaw, not his eyes. He looked at the woman the way he'd looked at the tree line that morning, present but distant, giving nothing. Tell Lady Voss, he said, that my route has changed. The woman's composure held, but Mira caught the micro-expression, the very fast rearrangement of expectation. She'll be disappointed. She often is. A pause that had several layers, and then the woman glanced at Mira with the particular acuity of someone trained to assess complications. And Mira looked back with her ledger face on, calm, direct, giving nothing. And the woman dipped her head again and went back into the inn. Mira walked up to stand beside him. Lady Voss, she said, low. Not a question. Aldrich's sister, he said, who has for some years entertained an ambition about what she and I might be to each other. And are you? He looked at her sideways. No. But she has an ambition. She has a family that shares certain qualities with Aldrich, yes. He began walking toward the inn. After a moment, it's not a situation I've handled well. She fell into step beside him and thought, he's telling me this. He didn't have to tell me this. She filed that beside the 4 days in Ashfin, the early morning wall, the I've wondered, and felt the ledger in her head shifting under the weight of a different kind of arithmetic. Inside the inn's common room, the innkeeper set them at a corner table and brought a midday meal without being asked. Stew and dark bread and a carafe of something that smelled like local cider. And did it all with his eyes down and his movements slightly too efficient. And Mira thought, he knows exactly who this is. She waited until he'd gone. Does everyone know you? She asked. They know the Crown. The Crown tends to precede me. That must be... She paused, looking for the right word. Lonely, he said, before she could find it. Simple, unapologetic, just the word. And then he picked up his spoon and began eating as though he hadn't just handed her something he probably didn't hand to anyone. Mira looked at her bowl, breathed. I've been managing a village of 400 people for 8 years, she said carefully. And every person in it knew my business before I knew it myself, and had opinions about what I should be doing differently, and needed things from me that I didn't always have. It's not the same. A pause. But I understand the particular exhaustion of being defined by the thing you do rather than who you are. He had gone still. Not his usual, controlled stillness, but a different kind. The stillness of a man who was not expecting something, and had been met with it anyway. She didn't look at him. She ate her stew. After a moment, he did too. They ate together in a corner of a border inn with the sounds of a market town moving around them, and the cider was sharp and cold, and the stew was good, and nothing was resolved, and everything was different from how it had been that morning, and Mira Valden catalogued all of it with the careful precision of a woman who had been keeping accounts her whole life and was beginning to suspect she was building toward a figure she hadn't allowed herself to look at directly yet. The trouble arrived with the afternoon. Mira was in the inn's small yard, having located the pump and the soap and having made a dedicated effort to remove the smell of smoke from her hair when she heard the horses. Not one or two, 8, at least, by the sound, and moving fast, and from the north road, which was the road they'd come in on. She looked up. Her wolf blood, which had settled somewhat over the course of a morning and a meal, went back on alert with the single-minded efficiency of a very good alarm. Pack soldiers. Different ones this time. Calder's colors. She recognized them now. The dark gray and silver she'd seen on the carriage. And these soldiers wore them openly, which meant they weren't trying to hide what they were. They came into the yard at a controlled pace, their lead rider a woman with close-cropped hair and a captain's insignia on her shoulder. And that captain's eyes went immediately to Mira and held. "Are you the border woman?" the captain said. "Ashvin?" Mira put her spine straight. "I am." The captain's expression did something complicated. "His Majesty is requested in the main room, and you are also requested." A pause that had politics in it. "Lord Aldrich's man arrived an hour ago." Mira dried her hands on the rough cloth by the pump and thought about the particular specific pleasure of being told she was requested in a situation she had no standing in, and followed the captain inside. The main room had rearranged itself. The other travelers had vacated, politely, hastily, and what was left was a table with Calder Voss at one end, still standing, and at the other end a man Mira didn't recognize, who she immediately filed under. Aldrich's man. Definitely, because he had the particular quality of someone whose confidence was borrowed from someone else's power. He was thick-necked, florid, in traveling clothes that were expensive and dirty, and he was looking at Calder with the expression of a man who had been sent to deliver a message he personally disapproved of. He was also, Mira realized with a cold drop in her stomach, looking at her. "Lord Aldrich extends his condolences for the regrettable incident at Ashvin," the man said to Calder, in a tone that made condolences sound like the opposite of condolences. "He requests the return of any Ashvin residents currently traveling under Crown protection, pending inquiry into the legitimacy of the border settlement titles." Mira's breath caught. It was neatly done. She recognized the architecture of it even as her lungs were tightening around it. An inquiry into settlement titles meant any person from Ashvin could be held as a material witness to territory claims, which meant they could be detained at Aldrich's pleasure. Which meant, "Denied," Calder said. One word. Same low, unhurried voice. The room absorbed it and went very quiet. Aldrich's man straightened. "My Lord King, Lord Aldrich has the legal—" "He does not." Calder had not moved. His hands were at his sides, relaxed, and that was the most dangerous thing about him, that he could say something absolute while looking entirely at rest. "The inquiry you're describing requires a court order, which requires my seal, which has not been issued and will not be. The border settlement titles are valid. Any Ashvin resident currently under Crown protection remains under Crown protection." A pause. That was also a warning. "You may tell Aldrich that." The man's jaw worked. He had more to say. She could see it. The preparation for it. the calculation. And then something in the way Calder was standing resolved itself into the particular geometry of a man who was done with the conversation, and the other man went somewhere practical in himself and made the choice. "My Lord King," he said flatly, turned, left. The door closed. The quiet that followed was the kind that happens after something with fangs moves through, and the smaller creatures are deciding whether to breathe yet. Mira breathed. "Settlement titles," she said. "He's going to challenge them. He's going to try." Calder turned from the door. "He won't succeed. You can promise that." "Yes." He looked at her and said it again. Different weight. "Yes." She held his gaze and thought about the kind of promise that was just words, and the kind that was backed by something with teeth, and she was wolf blood enough to know which one this was. She felt it in her blood. Not the sovereign resonance this time, but something more specific, more directed, something her bones recognized as meant for her. Her hands were cold. She pressed them together. "There's still a warrant," he said, "for Aldrich. It was issued before we left the capital, before I knew about Ashfin." A pause. "I want you to understand that. The timing." She did understand it. She was not entirely certain she forgave it yet, but she understood it, which was a different thing, a first step toward a different thing. "Why does it matter that I understand it?" she asked. His jaw worked. The scar caught the afternoon light from the window. "Because I made a wrong calculation and Ashfin burned and you lost everything that was yours, and I need—" He stopped. This was new. She had not heard him stumble before. "I need it to matter that I told you the truth." She looked at him across the afternoon-lit room and thought, there it is again. There is the thing underneath the stillness. And she made herself stay with it, not look away, not reach for her ledger face, because she was practical, and she was honest with herself even when it was inconvenient. And what she was honest about right now was that the man standing in front of her was not simple, and was not cold, and had done a thing he couldn't undo and was not running from it. And her blood was pulling toward him with the particular certainty of a compass that had finally found its north. Her wolf bond was doing something. She'd been trying not to name it for hours. She named it now, privately, in the back of her mind where she kept the things she wasn't ready to say out loud. Recognition. The deep animal certainty of a wolf bond meeting the thing it was made for. It was possible she was wrong. She was aware she might be wrong. She was not wrong. "It matters," she said, "that you told me the truth." He went still. The other kind. The new kind. The kind she was starting to know from the controlled kind. The kind that meant he was being careful with something he didn't want to break. She let the moment have its space. Then she looked toward the window because she needed to look somewhere else for a moment and said, "What happens now?" "That is largely your decision." She turned back. "How?" "You have nowhere to go." Flat, factual, not unkind. "Ashfin is gone. You have no family pack, no established territory. Crown law offers you 3 options. Resettlement in any open border village, a post in the district administrative office, or—" He paused. "Continued crown protection. At the capital." Mira looked at him for a long time. "At the capital," she said. "Yes." "Which you would arrange." "Which I would arrange." She turned back to the window. The market square was returning to normal outside. Voices, a cart, someone calling a name. And she thought about Ashfin's account ledgers, which were ash now, and the territorial clerk's letter in Dawnmere, which had offered her a post she'd been too frightened to take, and the 8 years of choosing the certain thing over the uncertain one, and where that had gotten her. Standing in a border inn, with smoke still somewhere in her hair, across from the alpha king of the northern packs, who had been watching her argue with grain merchants in the early morning for 4 days, and had apparently found the watching worthwhile. She had a blind spot. She'd always known it. The name of it was, she did not believe she was chosen. She was capable, and she was needed, and she was the person other people came to, and she was good at all of it. But chosen, wanted, specifically, for being herself and not for what she could provide, that she had filed under, not for me, somewhere around the age of 19, and had not reopened the file since. The Alpha King was watching her across a border inn, had been watching her for 4 days, had said, "I've wondered," had said, "It matters that I told you the truth." She breathed. "I'll consider it," she said. "That's all I asked," he said. It wasn't all he wanted. She could read that in the quality of the silence. She chose not to address it yet, because she was Mira Valden, and she did things deliberately and not in the first afternoon after everything she'd known burned down. And if he'd been watching her in the market square for 4 days, he already knew that about her. She thought he probably did. They stayed one night in Silver because the captain, her name was Soren, Mira learned. And she had a habit of rolling her signet ring around her smallest finger when she was thinking, which was almost constantly. Had dispatches that needed to be answered before they moved again. Mira was given a room on the 2nd floor, small and clean and smelling of pine soap, and she lay on the narrow bed and listened to the sounds of the inn and the town, and thought about accounts. Not Ashvin's accounts, her own, what she owed, what was owed to her. The balance of a life lived in one place for so long it had become the whole of the ledger, and now the ledger was empty, and she was lying in a strange bed with the scent of an Alpha King still in her coat which was folded over the chair beside her, and the faint residue of smoke in her hair, and the very specific feeling of standing at the edge of something that did not have a name. She did not sleep for a long time. Across the hall, she knew, in the bone-deep way Wolf-blood knew proximity. He did not sleep either. Morning came gray and cold. Captain Soren had her dispatches sorted and her horses ready by first light, and the small caravan that had gathered around the black carriage in the night, 4 additional riders, the captain, 2 supply carts, moved out of Silver at a pace that suggested business rather than leisure. And Mira sat in the carriage with Calder Voss as she had the morning before, except that everything was different now, and they both knew it. She had been thinking. "The settlement fund," she said, when the town had fallen away behind them. "The one for Ashvin. You said you'd see to it personally. I will. It needs to cover the accounts." She had been running figures in her head since the middle of the night. Not just the buildings. Paul Denner's overcharging created a deficit in the common fund for 2 years, and I was managing it, and those records are gone. The residents who qualified for resettlement will need to demonstrate their prior holdings, and without the accounts. You remember the accounts. She paused. Yes. Write them. Quiet. Not quite a question, not quite an order. Whatever you remember. I'll have it certified by the Crown's record office. She looked at him. He was watching the road through the curtain's gap. The morning light caught the scar differently than the inn's firelight had. Bluer. Older. More a part of him. That would mean staying near the capital long enough to complete them, she said. Yes, he said. A pause. How long would that take? She asked. Weeks, he said. Possibly months, if the inquiry becomes complicated. She looked at her hands. And you would need someone familiar with the border settlement system, someone who had managed the accounts. Specifically. Another pause. Longer this time. You're not subtle, she said. Something moved on his face, the line at the corner of his mouth, brief and there and gone. I find I'm less concerned about subtlety than I was 3 days ago. Her chest did the thing again, and she did not bother suppressing it this time. "I'll write the accounts," she said. "We can discuss the rest." "Yes," he said. And it was the most satisfied one word she had ever heard in her life, and she looked out the curtain at the road ahead and allowed herself, just for a moment, to feel the particular complicated warmth of a thing that was beginning. The capital came to them before they reached it, the way large things do. First in the quality of the road, the regularity of the mile markers, the increasing frequency of riders bearing gray and silver colors. Then in the smell, stone and water, and the particular density of a place where many people lived and moved and traded and argued, a smell she recognized from the 2 times she'd traveled to the district center as a girl, that smell of consequence, of history, of things that mattered. Then in the pale shape of towers on the horizon, rising from a river bend into an afternoon sky gone pale gold. She had never been to the capital. She did not say this. She watched it approach and kept her expression neutral and thought. Mira Valden, who kept the accounts for Ashvin and argued with grain merchants and stood at the east wall watching the road every evening, who had never in 22 years left the border territory, was about to enter the capital city of the northern Pax in the Alpha King's own carriage. She thought she deserved some credit for how calm she was being about this. "You've never been," Calder said. Not a question. She looked at him. He was watching her face again. He did that, she'd noticed, with the careful attention of a man reading weather. "Is it that obvious?" "Only to me," he said. And then, as though he had not said something quietly devastating, "The river is worth seeing from the North Bridge. If you want, we can come in that way." She thought about the woman who stood at the east wall every evening with her left hand on the stone and her right hand in her pocket, watching the road. She thought about the letter she hadn't answered. "Yes," she said. "I want." The river, as it turned out, was worth seeing. She would not have said she was a woman moved by architecture or landscape. She was a woman moved by numbers, by accuracy, by the satisfaction of a well-kept record. But the river at the North Bridge in late afternoon was the kind of thing that happened to you whether you were prepared for it or not. The light falling in long gold angles across the water, the towers reflected and rippling, the city spreading up from the banks in layers of stone and iron and window glass that caught the sun and returned it in 100 different temperatures of light. It was beautiful in the way that things are beautiful when they have been built by enough people over enough time. Not designed for effect, but accumulated into something that exceeded any single intention. She pressed her nose to the gap in the curtain like a girl, and she didn't care. When she pulled back, he was watching her with that careful expression, and she raised an eyebrow at him. He looked away first. She filed that under. Telling. The palace was set above the river bend, stone and old growth, and the smell of... She stopped. She caught it before she could help herself. The scent that had been threading through her since the carriage. Calder's scent, familiar now, catalogued and mapped, but richer here, fuller. The way a scent deepens when you find its source. The palace smelled of him the way his coat smelled of him. This place was his, was in him, was built into the wolf bond he carried, and her wolf blood recognized it and responded, and she was very glad she was in a carriage and not standing somewhere visible. She breathed through it. "We'll put you in the south guest quarters," he said, and his voice was slightly different. She caught it, just barely, the way a note shifts when a musician is playing close to the edge of something. "Captain Soren will arrange whatever you need." She looked at him steadily. "And you?" "I have to meet with the council. A beat. There's the matter of Aldrich's warrant." "Of course." She paused. "When does that happen?" "Tomorrow morning." He looked at her. I'd like you to be present." Her head came up. "You're the accountant of Ashvin," he said carefully. "You're the most knowledgeable person regarding what was lost. The council will want to understand the scope before they confirm the warrant." It was all true, and it was also— she could see it. She could read it in the care of his choosing. Something else, too. Her presence at a council session was a statement. His bringing her was a statement. She understood politics well enough to understand what kind. "All right," she said. He nodded once. Outside, the palace gates were opening. The south guest quarters were nicer than anywhere Mira Valden had ever slept, which set a bar so low it was nearly underground, and she was too exhausted to be self-conscious about the carved bed frame and the window that overlooked a garden, and the pitcher of warm water that appeared as if by arrangement. And she washed and she ate the food that was brought to her, and she sat at the writing desk and began, from memory, with the particular focused calm of a woman who had been keeping accounts in her head since she was 14, to reconstruct Ashvin. She worked until the candle guttered. It was a good candle, the best she'd ever used, and it lasted longer than she expected. When she finally slept, she slept without dreams. The council chamber was built to intimidate, which was a design Mira recognized and held at arm's length. High ceilings, long table, good light directed at the person presenting, rather than the people judging. 8 council members, 5 men and 3 women, all of them in their middle years or past, all of them wearing the well-settled expression of people who had been powerful for long enough that they'd stopped performing it. At the head of the table, which was not actually a throne, she noted, just a chair that happened to be larger, which was its own kind of message. Calder Voss. He had changed from the traveling coat. He wore gray now, the formal deep gray of the crown's military colors, with silver at the throat, and he looked different. Not more impressive, because he had been entirely impressive in the dark carriage in the small hours of the morning, but more public, more deliberate. The controlled stillness on display rather than simply present. She sat in the chair that had been placed to the right and slightly behind his, which was also a message she noted, and she folded her hands on her account papers and breathed, and Calder Voss looked at the assembled council and said, without preamble, "Lord Aldrich's warrant for the Ashvin raid, the evidence and the recommendation." And then he looked at her. She stood. She opened her pages. She presented the accounts of Ashvin with the precise, unhurried accuracy of 8 years of practice, and she did not flinch when one of the council members challenged the legitimacy of the settlement titles, and she did not raise her voice when another suggested the raid had been a legitimate territorial enforcement action, and she met each challenge with the specific weight of her numbers, her memory, her 8 years of standing in the market square with a ledger and knowing that the record was the truth, and the truth was the only thing that held. She was not a warrior. She was not a pack noble. She was an accountant. She was devastating. When she finished, there was a silence of the kind that follows a clean and irreversible argument, and then a council member on the far end, a woman with silver-streaked hair and reading spectacles on a cord, looked at Calder and said, "The warrant stands. Any further questions about scope can be addressed with Mistress—" A pause. "Valden," Mira said. "Mistress Valden," the council member said, with the specifically evaluating look of a woman who had been in that room a long time and was calculating something. At the Crown's convenience. Mira sat down. Calder had not moved through any of it. She could feel his attention the way you feel warmth from a fire. Not looking at it, just aware of the direction. When she was seated, he said to the council, "The settlement fund disbursement, Aldrich's remand, and the border territory review, by the end of the month." Voices around the table, the particular efficient murmur of people who had accepted a direction and were now distributing its execution, and then the session was dismissed, and people moved and gathered papers, and the room began to breathe again. The silver-haired councilwoman stopped beside Mira's chair on her way out. "You argued better than most of the advocates I've seen in here," she said. "Dry, observational, no more warmth than necessary. You should know that." Mira looked up at her. "Thank you." The woman glanced at Calder, who was speaking with the captain of the guard across the room, and then back at Mira. Something in her expression shifted, assessed, concluded. "Welcome to the capital, Mistress Valden," she said, and moved on. Mira sat for a moment with the weight of a welcome she hadn't asked for from a quarter she hadn't expected, and then she collected her papers and stood. Calder crossed to her as the room emptied. He moved through space the way he always did, as though the space rearranged to accommodate him rather than the other way around, and he stopped close enough that she could read the warmth in his scent over the formality of the chamber, pine and iron, and old power, and something underneath those that she was becoming fluent in. "The council will confirm the disbursement by week's end," he said. "Good." She gathered the last of her pages. "You were—" He stopped. She looked up and caught the expression before he could adjust it. Something open on his face, unguarded, the way the scar was unguarded. She had not seen him look like that before. He looked, just for a moment, like a man seeing something he had been hoping to see for longer than was strictly logical. "You were extraordinary," he said quietly, and meant it with a directness that bypassed any protocol entirely. She held his gaze. Her heart was doing something impractical. "The accounts were accurate," she said, which was not what she meant. "Yes," he said. "They were." A breath. "There is a thing," he said carefully, "that I haven't told you." He paused. "About Ashvin, about why I went." She waited. "I've been reading district reports for 2 years," he said. "Part of the border review, the settlement villages. And there was one name in the accounts, the tithe records, the arbitration filings, the same name, over and over, in every document that made the border settlements look like they were actually working as they were designed to work." A pause. "I came to Ashvin because I wanted to understand why those records were as good as they were." She looked at him. "I came," he said, even more carefully, "to meet the person who kept them." The chamber was empty. The afternoon light came in through high windows and lay across the long table in pale gold bars, and Mira Valden stood in the middle of it and felt the specific physical sensation of a piece of arithmetic she had been refusing to run finally resolving into its answer. He had come to Ashvin for her, not knowing, not intending, not as a design. He had come to meet the woman who kept the records, and he had stayed to watch her argue with grain merchants, and he had been in the carriage when she climbed in, and he had let the wheels carry them south, and he had told her the truth at Mere Hollow even when silence would have been easier. She had thought the bond pull was her wolf blood being unreliable. She had filed it under. Inconvenient. Inadvisable. Not for me. But he had been watching her from the east wall for 4 days. "I didn't know when I went to Ashvin," he said, "that it would burn, that I need you to believe." His jaw worked. "And I need you to know that I've thought about nothing else since. What I could have done, what I should have done, what would have—" He stopped. "I failed you before I knew your name, and I don't—" Another stop. He was not a man who ran out of words. She watched it happen and felt the weight of it. "I don't know how to account for that." She thought about Ashvin, about the accounts that were ash and the accounts she'd reconstructed from memory in one night by candlelight, about her father's copper weights, about the letter she'd never answered, about standing at the east wall every evening, left hand on the stone, right hand in her pocket, watching the road. What was she waiting for? She breathed. "I don't forgive you," she said, and he went very still. "Not yet. Not because I won't, but because it hasn't been long enough and I need to be honest." She looked at him directly. "Ashvin was mine, 8 years of it, and it's gone, and that's real, and me standing here doesn't make it not real." A pause. "But I understand the difference between malice and miscalculation, and you've been—" She stopped, made herself say it. "You've been honest, since the way station. You didn't have to be." "I did," he said. "Not by obligation." His voice had gone quiet again. "By necessity. Because the alternative was—" He looked at her and didn't finish the sentence, and she understood it anyway. The alternative was you not knowing, you not trusting, you not— "I'm still here," she said. Simply. He looked at her. The unguarded thing was still on his face, and she stopped trying to name it, and just let it be what it was, because she was through filing things under "not for me," and "not this," and "not possible." "Yes," he said, "you are." 3 days passed. She reconstructed all of Ashvin's accounts, 7 years and 4 months of records, from the detailed store of her own memory, and handed them to the Crown's record office, and the settlement fund disbursement was confirmed on the 4th morning. Captain Soren, who Mira had come to understand as the most competent person in the entire palace complex, showed her the territorial clerk's office and the market record archives and several other things she hadn't asked about but found indispensable, and did all of it with the expression of someone following orders she personally approved of. On the 4th evening, Mira walked down to the river. The North Bridge at evening was different from the afternoon she'd arrived. The gold had gone gray-blue, the water darker, the city's lights starting in windows above the bank. She stood with her left hand on the bridge rail and breathed the cool water smell and thought about accounts. She heard his step before she turned. She knew it now. She would always know it now. The weight of it. The particular economy. He came to stand beside her the way he had at Mirhollow, and she let him, and they stood together looking at the river. "The council approved the border review expansion," he said, after a while. "Permanent status, with a proper administrator." She looked at the water. "Is that a question?" "It is entirely whatever you want it to be," she breathed. "And the administrator, who would that be?" "Someone," he said, "who already knows the records better than anyone currently employed in the district office." A pause. A boat moved below them on the river, its lantern a wavering orange point. "There's also," he said, and his voice had shifted, become more careful in the way she had learned to read as meaning. "This is the one that costs me. There's also the matter of what I'm asking for that isn't about administration." A pause. "What I've been asking for, I think, since the carriage. Since before." He turned to look at her, and she turned to meet it. "I won't dress it in politics or practicality. That's not what I'm doing." She looked at him in the blue evening and felt her wolf blood, which had been naming this for 2 days with increasing insistence, go absolutely quiet. Not subdued. Settled. The way a compass needle settles when it finds north and knows it won't need to search again. "What are you doing?" she asked. "I'm asking you to stay," he said. "Not as a record keeper. Not under Crown protection." He looked at her without the controlled stillness, without the armor of all that dark patience. "As mine." She held that. She thought about the file she'd kept marked "not for me" and the woman who stood at the east wall watching the road, and the letter she'd never answered. She thought about the first morning in the carriage, his hands around the water flask, the way he'd looked when she'd said it, "Matters that you told me the truth." She thought about what she wanted. "I need the apology first," she said. "A real one. not a settlement fund. He didn't hesitate. I owe you one. I owe Ashvin one. I made a calculation that cost you everything you'd built, and there is no making that right. There's only what comes after. He looked at her and she felt the weight of it land, undeflected. I'm sorry. For the calculation and for the wrong of it and for the 4 days I spent watching you from a distance instead of walking up to you in that market square and saying, there is a raid coming and I'm going to stop it. I should have. His jaw was tight. His eyes were not. I am sorry for all of it. She breathed. Let it settle. Let it be real. Let the sorry have the weight it deserved and the weight it carried, and let the place in her that had been keeping the account of it finally, carefully, set the pen down. All right, she said. He went still, waiting. The border administration post, she said, and the rest. She looked at him with all the steady directness of a woman who had been keeping accurate records her entire life and had no intention of stopping now. But I'll need an office, a real one, not a corner of the archive. Done. And the district clerk in Donmere needs to be replaced. He's been misrecording the tithe weights for 3 years. I'll issue the order. And she stopped, breathed, looked at the river and the lights and the evening settling over the city, and felt the particular warmth of a choice being made freely and completely, for the first time, in a direction she had always pretended not to want. She turned to him. Come here, she said. He crossed the last space between them with the careful economy of a man who had been patient for long enough, and he raised one hand and set it along her jaw, the careful hand, the one that knew what it could break. And she looked up at him in the blue-gray evening above the river and thought, there it is. The thing her wolf blood had been saying since the carriage. The thing the bond knew before her mind would follow. He looked at her the way he had looked at nothing else she had ever seen him look at. Mira Valden, he said quietly, with the full weight of a name he had been learning since before she knew he was learning it. Calder Voss, she said, and watched what that did to his face, the way it moved through him, and lifted her hand to cover his. The river moved below them. The city lights multiplied in the water. Somewhere in the middle of the bridge, the Alpha King of the Northern Pax and the accountant of Ashvin stood together in the cooling dark, and his wolf bond reached through the air between them and caught, and her wolf blood recognized it and answered, and neither of them moved for a long moment because sometimes the threshold of a thing is the best part, the breath before, the hand already raised, the moment just before you step from the known into the other. Then she rose on her toes and closed the distance herself, because she was Mira Valden, and she did not wait for things she had decided she wanted, and when she pulled back and looked at him, there was no control on his face at all. Just him, just the scar and the silver eyes, and the man who had watched her argue with grain merchants, and had come to the border for her name, and had sat in silence in a burning night, and let the wheels carry her away from everything and toward this. He laughed, soft, surprised, undone. The sound a man makes when he has been trying to be patient, and has just discovered that patience is no longer required. She filed it under. Mine. The warrant for Lord Aldrich Voss was executed 3 weeks later. Mira was present at the reading, sitting in the council chamber, in the chair to the right and slightly forward this time, because that was where Captain Soren had put it and no one had questioned it, and she had found she preferred to be slightly forward. She read the record of it into the official accounts herself, in her clear, unhurried hand, and filed it in the border archive under resolved. She did not forgive Aldrich. She did not need to. Forgiveness was a thing she kept the ledger on herself, and some debts were satisfied by completion rather than absolution, and what had been owed to Ashvin had been paid in full by the work of the record and the weight of the law, and a man who had taken responsibility for his wrong calculation and had not stopped taking it. Lady Voss, Aldrich's sister, the woman from the inn-yard in Silvere, sent a formal objection to the capital. Mira read it, noted the particular quality of its grievance, and filed a response that was legally airtight and entirely unsparing. And that was the end of that. Her office was in the south wing. It overlooked the garden. She had found it inadequate and had spent 2 afternoons rearranging it to her satisfaction, which had involved moving a desk that a palace steward had insisted could not be moved, and a bookshelf that she had moved herself while the steward was still explaining why it couldn't be done. Captain Sorin had watched this with the expression of a woman watching something that confirmed her existing hypothesis. On a morning in the 3rd week, Calder stood in the doorway of the office and watched her cross-reference a set of border district population records against the tithe rolls, and she looked up and caught him doing it and said, "You're doing the thing." "What thing?" "The Market Square thing, where you watch." He looked entirely unrepentant. "You have a system," he said. "I'm learning it." She set her pen down and looked at him, at the dark traveling coat he still wore even in the palace because old habits ran deep, at the scar that was part of him the way all the old things were part of him, at the way he stood in the doorway as though he had always been going to end up here, in this specific doorway, looking at this specific woman. She thought about the carriage, the darkness and the smoke smell, and the moment she had climbed in and found him already there, already waiting, already watching her without yet knowing he was waiting for her. She thought about the title she had claimed for herself that night, the one she had not had words for then, the woman who hid in his carriage to escape the raid, who had found in the hiding the one thing she had never let herself look for. "You already know my system," she said. "I know your system," he agreed, and crossed the room. "I'd like to know the rest." She gave him her hand, her right hand, the one that was never in her pocket when she stood at the east wall anymore, because she had stopped standing at the east wall, because there was no road left to watch, because everything she had been waiting for had already arrived, and she felt the bond settle around them like a thing that had always been true, and breathed, and thought. The accounts balance. She had lost everything, and found the only thing that mattered. She had climbed into his carriage to escape what was burning. She had not known she was climbing toward him, and he had known, the moment her scent filled the air, that she already was.